Hi, I'm Jon Oltsik, analyst in residence at theCUBE Research, and I'm here with Krista Case. Hi, Krista.
Hey John, how are you doing today?
I'm well, thanks. And we're here to talk about cybersecurity. And we've talked a lot about that. I've been talking about it for over 20 years. But recently, you've drawn the distinction and really emphasized the distinction between cybersecurity and cyber resilience. So can you elaborate on that? Why is that part of the conversation? Why is it so important now?
Yeah, absolutely, John. It's important for a few reasons. One reason is we're seeing the need for, sort of some integration in interoperability between these two domains. But that being said, there's a lot of sort of gray area and confusion because we have vendors that typically sit in cybersecurity talking about some of their resilience capabilities and vice versa. Some of these vendors sitting in the cyber resilience side of the house that are talking to their security capabilities. So what I wanted to do was two things. The first is really sort of define what we see as falling into both areas to reduce some of that confusion in the market. But second, and even maybe more importantly, talk to why we need these two areas, why we need to kind of study them together and why they need to work together today.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, especially as we look at the business case for cybersecurity. But you can't cross the street these days without talking about AI. So how is AI changing the game here?
Yeah, certainly. So AI is really accelerating the pace that vulnerabilities can be detected, but it's also better enabling malicious actors to exploit those vulnerabilities. And I know that the Anthropic mythos kind of development has been a hot topic over the last few weeks. And that's a great example of sort of this speed, that we're seeing. And I think the more interesting part of this conversation is the ripple effect that this creates sort of downstream. So we've already been seeing that organizations are struggling to be able to keep up with the pace that vulnerabilities are being discovered. So that window really needs to be compressed to near zero, but it's very difficult. So security and IT teams are already overwhelmed. And now we have these AI technologies that are, again, speeding the pace that these vulnerabilities are being created and speeding the pace that attackers can exploit them. So the response is becoming very constrained. We have, patch cycles and change management processes that take time. We have a difficulty in the ability to prioritize, which points of risk need to be addressed, and also limited resources in terms of headcount and even expertise to address them. And then finally, we also have silos that exist between security, IT, and engineering that also, constrain the ability to address this scale of vulnerabilities that are being detected. So in other words, even when issues are identified quickly, remediation still requires things like validation and testing and coordinated action. And that's a very sort of human-driven process. It's very bound by, by processes and fragmentation across these teams. So organizations can't keep up, and it's creating this backlog that becomes real exposure. I saw a recent post a couple of days ago from Jen Easterly that I thought was interesting, and she talked about the fact that AI is sort of dual use. So the same capabilities that are, better enabling defenders are also better enabling attackers to do their job. So that creates this bottleneck that I was referencing around risk. And it's a really systemic problem that even potentially has national security implications.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. I mean, we've already got millions, and an average enterprise has millions of vulnerabilities. And so we have to think, well, as we discover them, how can we move faster? And AI can help there. But I'm going to play devil's advocate for a second, because we made a distinction between cybersecurity and cyber resilience. Someone might ask, well, why can't we just improve cybersecurity? Why isn't security or improve security just good enough?
Yeah, absolutely, John. And I think to really dig into that, I'd like to take just one quick step back and talk to what we see as the distinction between cybersecurity and cyber resilience. So, cybersecurity, I think about it as sort of, building the fence up. So, it's about reducing the likelihood and the potential impact of an attack. You and I have talked a lot about the concepts of prevention, detection, and response that are very prevalent in this space. We tend to think about, reducing exposure, increasing the accuracy of detection, reducing the time to respond. And that's all very important. But in this day and age, we need to assume that those defenses are going to break down at some point, and there will be a successful breach that happens. And that's what cyber resilience assumes. So, cyber resilience is all about operating through that disruption, recovering from it, and also adapting to it, which I think, especially again, as attackers are armed with AI, is another very important piece of the conversation these days. And the emphasis in cyber resilience is about business continuity. So it's about being able to keep critical services running when you are faced with a breach. And it's also about being able to, again, adapt to and respond to those breaches. So when we talk about why isn't better security simply enough, so when we go back to the conversation we were having around mythos and sort of the role that AI is playing here, better security isn't enough because we simply can't patch everything fast enough. And even if we could, many of today's attacks don't rely on vulnerabilities at all. We have the rise of identity-driven attacks, we have social engineering, and these types of attacks bypass controls entirely. So we need to have this resilience and the strategy for cyber resilience that is validated in these real world attack scenarios to ensure that we can keep these critical functions running, to ensure that we can recover that business critical data, systems, and workflows quickly. And this really needs to be integrated at the outset and tested as part of our security and incident response strategies. And a couple things that I would also elaborate on is this requires coordinated ownership between IT and security and also the business, right? So the business is going to do things like determine the level of risk that it's willing to tolerate, determine the level of downtime or potential data loss that are required. So this conversation, it goes well beyond just sort of, technology and even policies. We need clarity on, roles, ownership, and operational functions as well.
Yes, and just on a personal note, I'm doing some work in healthcare. Healthcare industry talks about clinical resilience, and just from that term, you can tell it's dedicated toward patient care, not IT, not cybersecurity technology. So with that, as we look to make cybersecurity and cyber resilience operational, what does that look like?
Yeah. So from my perspective, John, I think we need more integration across three domains. So the first is identity and access management. The second domain is data security. And then the third is application security. And I'll talk a little bit to that. So looking at identity, we need access control that's very contextual, that's very dynamic. So we need to be able to evaluate users and devices and behaviors to really understand these potential risk signals in real time. You need to be able to enforce least privileged access on a continuous basis, especially as we consider the future where we all have AI agents that are acting autonomously on our behalf. That becomes very important. And so I tend to think about this as sort of a decision layer in terms of deciding what should be allowed or what should be blocked. And then the second piece of this is the data security layer. And this is where we gain the ability to really hone in on what matters most to the business. So the ability to identify where sensitive data lives and how it's being used becomes very important. And then the ability to prioritize our protection and recovery, based on business requirements and potential ripple effect also becomes very important. And there's some crossovers there with identity and access management when you think about, for example, applying data classification and sort of that insight across the access controls and usage monitoring that we're using to govern access. And the final kind of, or the third piece of this that I mentioned is application security. So modern applications and APIs, they expand our attack surface these days. And so we need to be able to understand our software code, understand dependencies and various integration points to know where new vulnerabilities are being introduced. And this requires security to be embedded across the development and runtime lifecycles. So again, John, I think of it sort of as these three domains that need to become more integrated and kind of share context with each other to be able to have that visibility and enforcement.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about cybersecurity and cyber resilience, and you've added a lot of context, which is great. But what should leaders take away from this discussion?
Yeah, I think what leaders should take away is that we need both cybersecurity and cyber resilience. So we certainly need to reduce our risk and lean into kind of those cybersecurity tools from that standpoint. But we also need to be able to survive, this inevitable disruption. And again, that's where cyber resilience comes into play. And I think we also really need to be able to prepare for this future of AI in terms of how adversaries are using AI, in terms of how AI is kind of reshaping, roles and functions within security and IT to be able to reduce that risk and to be able to enable that business continuity. So AI is sort of forcing what we were just talking about, the integration of these different domains to be able to do things like make decisions faster about risk tolerance and kind of prioritizing what needs to be recovered, for example. I definitely see a role in the future for contextualized automation across some of these processes, certainly with human oversight. And then finally, when we were talking about resilience, I talked about these different stakeholders that are at the table today. And so I think another takeaway is we need to have more clear ownership across these different stakeholders in terms of what their roles are today, in terms of decision making, in terms of response processes. So it's very much a conversation around new tools and technologies, but it's also very much a conversation around people and processes at the end of the day as well.
Yes, there's a lot to think about as we talked about. And I think what you're saying is we need to be proactive. We need to understand the differences here, plan for the two differences in cybersecurity and cyber resilience, and take action because AI doesn't sleep on anyone.
Absolutely, 100%.
All right. Well, Krista, thanks for elaborating on these topics, and we'll talk again soon.
Sounds great. Thanks so much.